Right now, without any effort on your part, something is happening inside your skull. Patterns of electricity are moving through a landscape you will never see, tracing paths that were carved by every morning you have ever woken up, every voice you have ever loved, every smell that once stopped you mid-stride on a sidewalk because it carried you somewhere else entirely. You are not doing this. You are simply lying here, and your brain is doing it for you, quietly, the way a river moves through a valley it shaped itself over centuries. What is doing that moving is the thing we are going to spend tonight exploring together. Memory, the most intimate technology in the known universe, built not from silicon or steel, but from living tissue that rewires itself every time something matters to you. And here is the first and perhaps most freeing thing I want to tell you before we go any further. You do not need to remember a single word I say tonight. That is not a small permission I am offering you. That is a genuine release. Let everything I say wash through you the way water moves through your cupped hands. If something stays, wonderful. If nothing stays, that is completely fine. Your brain will do with this night what it has always done with every night you have ever slept through, which is to say, it will work in its own good time, in its own quiet way, without asking your permission. I want you to feel that, the relief of it. You are a listener tonight, not a student. There is no test. There is no moment where I will pause and ask you to recall. The paradox of what we are about to explore is that the very act of relaxing, of letting go of the urge to hold on, is actually how the brain does some of its most profound and beautiful work. And so your softening attention, your drifting focus, your willingness to almost fall asleep while someone speaks to you about the science of the mind, all of that is not a failure. It is, in a very real sense, the point. Every idea I bring to you tonight will arrive wrapped in something you already know. If there is a complicated structure inside the brain, I will find you a kitchen, or a library, or a river delta to set it beside. If there is a chemical process that sounds like it belongs on the page of a textbook you never wanted to open, I will find the human moment hiding inside it, the grandmother, the soldier, the child standing at the edge of something enormous and not yet knowing what it is. I make you that promise now, at the very beginning, because I believe understanding is not a function of vocabulary. It is a function of recognition, and recognition does not require expertise. It only requires having been alive. So here is, very loosely, where we are going. We are going to begin with what memory actually is at the physical level, which is stranger and more beautiful than most people ever get to hear. We are going to look at how memories form in the first place, what happens in the brain in the milliseconds after something touches you and leaves a mark. We will wander into the different kinds of memory, because it turns out there is not just one kind, and that discovery, when scientists first fully understood it, changed everything about how we think about learning and identity and the self. We will spend some time with forgetting, which is not the enemy of memory, but something far more interesting. We will follow the story of sleep itself, the thing you are easing toward right now, and how sleep is not the pause between days, but one of the most active phases of memory's entire life. We will meet some of the people whose misfortune or curiosity cracked open the science, the patients, the researchers, the quiet observers who sat in hospital rooms or laboratory chairs and changed what the word remembering means. We will touch the edges of some questions that are still open, still breathing, still without full answers, because science is not a completed building, but a house under perpetual and wonderful construction. And then, toward the end of our night together, we will come back to something that does not need a technical name, the feeling of being a person who carries a past, who is shaped by what happened and by what the brain decided, often without your conscious consent, to keep. There is something moving in that, something worth sitting quietly beside. None of this will be rushed. There is no rush. The night is long and generous and has no deadline. My voice will stay at this pace, this unhurried, slightly slow pace that feels, I hope, like someone walking with you rather than leading you somewhere. If your eyes are already closed, let them stay closed. If your body is already sinking, let it sink. The information will arrive in its own time, and your only job is to breathe and allow it to come. We are beginning, then, somewhere very small. Somewhere so small it cannot be seen. And yet it is the place where everything that has ever happened to you lives. It is a junction, a meeting point, a place where one neuron reaches toward another across a gap so thin it makes the edge of a single human hair look like a canyon. That gap has a name, and the name itself is almost beautiful when you slow down enough to hear it, and what happens across it every time you encounter something new is the beginning of the whole story, the very first note in a piece of music that has been playing inside you since the day you arrived in the world, and it goes something like, before we go deeper into that gap between neurons, before we follow the chemistry of what happens there, I want to take you somewhere older. I want to take you back to a time when no one had ever looked inside a living brain, when no one had any instrument fine enough to see a synapse, and yet people were already sitting in dusty afternoon light and asking, with complete seriousness and genuine wonder, what memory actually is, because the questions came long before the tools to answer them, and the questions themselves are worth knowing, because they were asked by people who were, underneath everything, just as curious and just as puzzled as we are now. Imagine Plato. Imagine him in Athens, somewhere in the 4th century before the Common Era, trying to explain to a student what happens when an experience enters the mind and stays. He reaches for something everyone in that room would understand without any further explanation. He says, think of a block of wax. Think of the way wax feels before it has fully cooled, the slight give of it, the warmth still held inside it, the way your thumb leaves an impression when you press. He says the soul is like that, like a piece of wax that has been softened by experience and readiness, by youth and openness and attention. And when something happens to you, when you hear a word or see a face or feel the particular quality of an afternoon in a city you will never forget, something like a stylus presses into that warm surface. You can feel it, almost, the way the impression forms, sharp at first, clean-edged, deep. The wax holds the shape. That shape is the memory. But then time passes. The wax begins to harden. The impression is still there, still readable, but the material around it is no longer soft and yielding. It has become fixed. And here is the part of Plato's metaphor that carries a kind of quiet sadness. In an old and worn block of wax, the impressions can no longer form cleanly. The surface is too crowded, too hard, too full of old marks overlapping. New things press in and do not leave their proper shape. We recognize in this the experience of being very young, of being a child for whom everything is new and vivid and impossible to forget, and the experience of growing older, of finding that new things sometimes slide off the surface of a mind already thick with what has already happened. Plato was not doing science when he wrote this. He was doing philosophy, which is a different and, in its own way, equally rigorous kind of work. He was trying to find the right shape for an idea that had no physical address he could point to, and the wax tablet was his best way of saying, memory is an impression. Memory is the trace of something real, left in material that can hold it. He was closer to the truth than he could have known, not because the brain is literally wax, but because the metaphor of impression, of something physically altered by experience, turns out to be almost exactly what neurons do. He found the right shape for the idea 2,000 years before anyone could prove it. His student, Aristotle, came at the same question from a slightly different angle. Where Plato was interested in what memory was, Aristotle was interested in how memories were retrieved, how it is that one thought leads to another, how the mind moves through its own contents. He described what he called the laws of association, and they are so recognizable, so immediately obvious once you hear them, that it is almost surprising they needed to be named. The first law was contiguity. Things that happen together tend to be remembered together. If you learned a song at a particular table in a particular room, then seeing that table years later might bring the song back without any effort on your part. The table and the song became neighbors in time, and the mind filed them in the same drawer. You know this feeling. You have probably walked into a house you grew up in and had a memory arrive before you could name it, called up by nothing more than the smell of wood or the particular quality of afternoon light through a certain window. That is contiguity at work, the mind honoring the geography of when things happened. The second law was similarity. Things that resemble each other pull each other into mind. If you see a stranger on a train whose laugh sounds like someone you loved and lost, the resemblance, even if it is only partial, even if it is only that one note of a laugh, can open a door you had not planned to open. The mind is a relentless pattern matcher. It is always noticing what something is like, what it rhymes with, what earlier thing it echoes. And the third law was contrast. The opposite of a thing can summon the thing as readily as a copy of it. Silence can make you think of noise. A room empty of someone can make that person feel more present than they would in a crowd. Cold can call up warmth with a peculiar vividness that warmth itself sometimes cannot manage. This one is stranger, more poetic, and yet entirely true to experience. Absence, Aristotle noticed, has a memory of its own. These three laws, contiguity, similarity, contrast, were not experimental findings. Aristotle did not run trials or collect data or measure anything. He observed the mind the way a careful naturalist observes birds, patiently, closely, without imposing, and with enormous respect for what the thing itself was already doing. He was right about most of it. Modern psychology has refined and complicated and in places overturned what he said, but it built on top of him, which is how you know a foundation was laid well. Centuries later, in Rome, the art of memory took another form entirely, this one intensely practical. Roman senators needed to give speeches that lasted hours without notes. Lawyers needed to hold entire arguments in sequence without writing anything down, and so they developed a technique that was less philosophy and more architecture. Literally, you chose a building you knew well, perhaps your own home, its rooms familiar down to the cracks in the plaster, and then you walked through it in your mind, room by room, and you placed the things you needed to remember at specific locations along the route. At the threshold, the first argument; at the hearth, the second; at the window overlooking the garden, the third; at the foot of the stairs, the fourth. When the time came to speak, you walked the building in your imagination, and each room gave back what you had left there. The house became the speech. The architecture became the memory. This technique worked because it understood something about the mind that no one had yet put into scientific language. Memory loves place. Memory loves the specific and the concrete. The abstract floats, the located stays. A Roman senator placing his argument on his own threshold was using the mind's deep preference for geography, for the feeling of standing somewhere, for the difference between a threshold and a hearth and a staircase, to give slippery ideas a physical home where they would not get lost, and there the understanding essentially rested for a very long time. For 2,000 years, almost exactly, memory was the province of philosophers and rhetoricians. It was an art to be cultivated, a capacity to be trained, a mystery to be contemplated. No one looked at the brain and thought, "This is where we should be measuring." No one had the tools, of course, but more than that, no one yet had the idea that the tools were the point. The mind was not yet a laboratory question. That began to change in the 19th century, quietly at first, and then with gathering momentum, as a new kind of confidence spread through Europe. The confidence that the physical world, including the world of living things, including the world of thought itself, could be made to yield its secrets to measurement. Physiology was becoming precise. Physicists were weighing and timing and graphing things that had previously belonged only to intuition, and a new generation of thinkers began to believe, with great excitement and some hubris, that if you could measure reaction times and track nerve impulses and map the brain's electrical landscape, you might be able to put a number on something as intimate as remembering. This was the world. This particular moment of intellectual ambition and expanding instrument that made possible a man who held one of the stranger positions in the history of science. Not a professor, not a physician, a man who had educated himself in near isolation, who had read the philosophers and read the physiologists, and then, in a modest apartment with no laboratory, no funding, and no assistant, decided to measure the one mind he had complete and unconditional access to, his own. What he did with that access was so simple it is almost funny, and so rigorous it changed the entire direction of psychology. And I want to tell you exactly how he did it. His name was Hermann Ebbinghaus. The city was Leipzig. The year was 1878. And the scene, if you could have looked in through the window of that quiet apartment, would have been almost comically unglamorous for what it was about to become. A man sat alone at a desk. There was no equipment visible, no apparatus of any kind. Just paper, pen, and a list of syllables he had constructed himself. Syllables that did not mean anything. Dax, Bup, Lock, Riff, Mech, Zoll. He had invented thousands of them, these little three-letter sounds, carefully assembled so that they carried no associations, no definitions, no emotional coloring. They were the verbal equivalent of blank tiles. He read them aloud to himself at a steady pace, then set the list aside, waited, and later returned to see how many he could still recall. He did this for years. He was his own laboratory, his own subject, his own control group, his own instrument. He memorized lists in the morning and tested himself at night. He memorized lists at night and tested himself the next day. He memorized lists and waited 2 days, 4 days, a week, a month. He tracked not just what he remembered, but how long it took him to learn it again after the forgetting had set in. He filled notebooks with numbers that no one had ever gathered before because no one had ever thought to gather them this way. The nonsense syllables were the crucial invention, and it is worth understanding exactly why they mattered so much. If he had memorized real words, table, sadness, river, north, he would have been studying memory contaminated by everything those words already meant to him. The word river might pull in half a childhood. The word north might carry a feeling. Real words are never neutral. They arrive already connected to everything else, and those connections would have helped him remember them for reasons that had nothing to do with the pure fact of having read them recently. He needed to strip all of that away. He needed to study the naked capacity for retention, the brain's raw ability to hold a pattern it had just encountered, without the distorting assistance of meaning. So he made sounds that meant nothing. Dax and Bup and LOK were the controls in his experiment. They gave him pure signal. What he found when he graphed the numbers was a shape that no one had ever seen drawn before, but that everyone who looked at it immediately recognized. Forgetting, it turned out, does not happen at a steady rate. It does not proceed the way a clock ticks or the way water evaporates on a flat, dry day in steady wind. It plunges. The drop is sharpest immediately after learning, breathtakingly steep in the first hour, still very steep through the rest of the first day, and then it slows, noticeably, measurably slows, as though the rate of loss itself begins to tire. After a few days, what has survived tends to resist further loss with growing stubbornness. The slope flattens. The decline continues, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the last exhale of air from a nearly empty bellows. And crucially, it never quite reaches the floor. Think of a vessel filled with water, with a hole at the bottom whose size is not fixed but actually shrinks as the level drops. Water rushes out in the first minutes, dramatically, visibly, and you might watch that vessel and think, all of it will be gone by morning. But the hole is getting smaller. The rate of loss is falling even as the loss is still happening. Hours pass and there is still some water left, less than you would have guessed if you had only seen the first furious few minutes. Days pass and there is still a trace, a residue. The vessel never fully empties. The curve of its draining tells you something important, which is that the worst moment, the moment of maximum danger, was always the very beginning. That is the forgetting curve. Its mathematics have been refined since Ebbinghaus's notebooks, but its essential shape has held firm across more than a century of subsequent research and across every kind of material and every kind of mind. We forget fast, then slow, then almost not at all, but never quite nothing. The second thing he discovered was subtler and perhaps more beautiful, and he called it the saving score, when he went back to a list that seemed, by his own recall, completely forgotten, a list he could not reproduce a single syllable from. He found that relearning it took measurably less time than learning it had taken the first time. Something had remained. It was not accessible in the way a word is accessible when you reach for it and it comes. It was not available in any form he could name or report, but it was there, a kind of structural imprint, a groove that had not disappeared but only deepened below the surface of conscious retrieval. The relearning was faster, and the difference in speed was the trace. Memory, even when it seems entirely gone, often leaves behind this ghost that makes the return easier than the arrival. This reframed the meaning of forgetting entirely. Forgetting, in the Ebbinghaus picture, is not erasure, it is burial. What is buried can sometimes be excavated, and even when it cannot, the earth where it was buried is looser, easier to dig, than soil where nothing was ever placed. Now, he also discovered something that had enormous practical consequences, though it would take decades for the world to fully absorb them. The timing of study mattered a great deal. If you spread your study of something across multiple sessions separated by intervals, you retained far more than if you spent the same total time studying it all in a single block. This is not obvious. It feels like it should not be true. If you spend 2 hours with a list of French verbs, you might feel that 2 continuous hours should be strictly equivalent to 2 hours broken across 4 days, but they are not equivalent, not even close. Distributed practice produces retention that massed practice cannot match, even when the hours are identical. The analogy that makes this feel right is one from building. Imagine you are laying a floor in thin layers of concrete, one coat at a time. If you pour the second coat before the first has had any chance to set, the layers do not bond properly. They remain undifferentiated, wet and slippery against each other. But if you let the first coat begin to cure, not completely, not all the way, just enough that it has started to find its own structure, then the second layer has something to grip. The curing coat receives the new layer, and the two become something more than either was alone. Each interval between study sessions is like that partial curing time. The brain needs the gap. Something happens in the gap that does not happen during the studying itself, something consolidating and structural, and the next encounter with the material finds a surface that is ready to receive it. And then there was a third discovery, one that feels counterintuitive until it does not, and then it feels so obvious you wonder how you missed it. He found that the act of testing himself, the act of trying to retrieve something, did more for his retention than an equivalent time spent simply rereading the list. Reading the list again was passive. The material came to him, but testing himself forced him to reach, to search, to pull something up from wherever it had gone, and that reaching, that searching, that effortful retrieval left the material more accessible afterward than it had been before the attempt. Not because he refreshed his memory of what was there, but because the path to it had been used, and used paths widen. They become more navigable with each traversal. The act of remembering is itself a form of learning. That sentence sits quietly, but it is not small. It means that the moment you close your eyes and try to recall something you studied, try to hold it up in the mind without looking at the page, you are doing something more powerful than rereading that page would do. The retrieval is the practice. The reaching is what builds the road. All of this came from one man at one desk with lists of syllables that meant nothing, measuring his own mind with the patient precision of someone who understood that even the smallest human capacity, tested honestly, might reveal something enormous about the architecture of thought. He had shown how memory fades. He had shown that it leaves traces even in fading. He had shown that when we space the learning and when we practice the remembering, something different and deeper happens than when we simply sit before the material and let it wash over us again and again. These were the first quantitative facts about memory, the first time anyone had put a number and a graph and a method to something that had previously only been described in words. But before asking how memories grow old and fade, there is a question that has been waiting beneath the surface of everything we have said so far. How does a memory form at all? How does an experience travel from the outside world into a shape that can be held, even briefly, even imperfectly, inside the mind? What happens in the moments just before the forgetting begins? Consider what is happening right now, in this moment, as you lie still and listen. Your skin is registering the exact weight and texture of whatever covers you, the small pressures of every fold and crease in the fabric, the temperature at the tip of your nose versus the warmth behind your knees. Your ears are taking in not just this voice but the hum of whatever room you are in, perhaps a fan or a heater cycling, perhaps traffic at a distance, perhaps the infinitesimal creak of a building settling into its own weight. Your eyes, even closed, are registering the quality of the darkness, and whatever faint light lives at its edges. There is a small army of sensation arriving at the surface of you every single second. Thousands upon thousands of individual signals crossing from the outside world into the nervous system, each one a candidate, each one pressing its case for entry. Almost none of them get in. The mind is not a recording device. It is a door with an extraordinarily narrow opening, and the width of that opening is something we rarely think about because we experience the world as continuous and full. We do not feel ourselves refusing the sensation of the seam of our own sock. We do not feel ourselves discarding the sound of the ventilation system, but we are doing exactly that, constantly, automatically, with a thoroughness that borders on the ruthless. The brain is, among its many functions, a very efficient filter, And the first question memory has to answer is not how to hold experience, but how to decide, in fractions of a second, which experience is even worth trying to hold. But before that decision is made, before attention weighs in with its preferences and priorities, there is a brief and beautiful anteroom where everything is held for just a moment. It is not quite memory in the full sense, not yet. It is more like the after-image of memory, the trace a sparkler leaves against the dark after the spark itself has moved on. You know that effect, the way the glowing tip draws a circle in the air, and even though the tip of the sparkler is only ever in one place at one time, you see the whole arc as a continuous line of light. The light you see in most of that arc is not actually there anymore. You are seeing the recent past overlaid on the present. The visual system does something structurally similar in the first 100 milliseconds or so after seeing something. The impression lingers, complete and detailed, for just long enough to be useful. Psychologists who studied this carefully in the middle of the 20th century called it iconic memory, the visual echo, and it is extraordinarily brief, a fraction of a second. But it is also extraordinarily rich in the moment it lasts. It holds more detail than we could ever consciously read out. It fades too quickly for most of that detail to ever cross into awareness. The auditory version of this is called echoic memory, and it lasts a little longer, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds at its outer edge, which is just long enough to make speech coherent. Without it, you would not be able to understand a sentence, because by the time a sentence ended, the beginning would already be gone. The early syllables need to still be present, still vibrating somewhere in the system, when the later syllables arrive, so that the whole thing can be assembled into meaning. Think for a moment about the last 2 words you just heard. They are still there, faintly, in a way that the words from 2 minutes ago are not. That is not imagination. That is echoic memory, dissolving in real time, doing its quiet work, and then releasing. But most of what arrives in these ultra-brief sensory buffers never goes any further. It fades without ever becoming a memory in any lasting sense, because attention never landed on it. Attention is the gate, and what attention selects for further processing depends on a great many things. On what is moving, what is loud, what is unexpected, what connects to something the mind already finds meaningful. The gate, in other words, is not random. It is shaped by what already matters. And here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because it turns out that not all encoding is equal. Not all of the material that does get through the gate gets buried at the same depth. 2 researchers working in the early 1970s, thinking carefully about what distinguished memories that lasted from memories that quickly faded, proposed an idea that cut cleanly through a lot of confusion. The idea was that the durability of a memory had less to do with how long you were exposed to something and more to do with how deeply you had processed its meaning. At the shallowest level of processing, you might notice only the surface features of something, the shape of a word, for instance, whether it is printed in capital letters or lowercase, whether it rhymes with something else. You have registered the word in some sense, but you have not really engaged with what it means, with why it matters, with how it connects to anything you already know, and the trace it leaves is correspondingly thin. Go deeper, and you begin to ask what the word refers to. You begin to connect it to other things you know. You begin to feel something about it, or place it in a context, or ask how it relates to your own life, and the trace becomes correspondingly richer, more interconnected, more likely to be findable later when you reach for it. The analogy that makes this vivid is one from the physical world. Imagine pressing a leaf into wet plaster. The plaster receives the leaf completely, every vein and edge and subtle curve of the surface, and when the leaf is removed, the impression remains, detailed and lasting. Now imagine placing the same leaf on a square of dry concrete. The leaf sits on top, nothing is received. The concrete has no give, nothing to yield to the shape of the leaf, and when the leaf is removed, there is no trace of it at all. The depth of the impression depends not on the leaf, but on the softness of the surface receiving it. Meaning softens the surface. When you process something deeply, when you think about what it signifies and how it connects to your own experience, you are, in a sense, keeping the plaster wet. You are maintaining the conditions under which a real impression can form. Emotion does something related, and it does it in a way that involves a small structure deep in the brain, almond-shaped, called the amygdala, which responds strongly to experiences that carry emotional weight. There is good evidence that when the amygdala is active during an experience, it influences how well that experience is encoded, that it signals to the rest of the memory system that this moment carries significance and should be preserved with some care. This is why you are more likely to remember where you were when something shocking happened than where you were on an unremarkable Tuesday. The emotional charge is not just a feeling attached to the memory. It is part of what makes the memory last. Novelty works similarly. The brain has mechanisms for detecting when something unexpected is happening, and those detection systems seem to boost the encoding of the surprising thing. If you meet 12 people at a party, and one of them is doing something completely unusual, you will almost certainly remember that person. Novelty is a signal that something might be important, and the system responds by holding it more carefully. Personal relevance operates through a slightly different channel, but toward the same end. Information that connects to your own life, your own identity, your own ongoing concerns, is encoded more richly than information that seems to have nothing to do with you. Researchers sometimes call this the self-reference effect, and it is robust. When you think not just about what a word means in general, but about what it means to you specifically, the encoding deepens further. Perhaps you are still following all of this carefully, tracking each idea as it arrives. Or perhaps, somewhere in the last few minutes, you have begun to soften, to let the sentences wash over you in a more general way, the meaning arriving not as precise propositions, but as something warmer and more diffuse. If that is where you are, that is exactly where you are supposed to be. The ideas that have passed through here tonight do not require your vigilance to begin their work. The encoding we have been describing does not demand effort to complete. Some of what has landed here will settle further in the quiet that follows, in the hours when the consolidating work of sleep does what waking never can. What remains now is one more question for this slow, unhurried journey. All of this encoding, the filtered signal, the sensory shimmer, the plaster softened by meaning and emotion and surprise, all of it has to go somewhere. There has to be a place where experience changes from a passing thing into a stored one, from an event into a trace. Where that transformation happens and what organ orchestrates it is one of the stranger and more beautiful stories in the entire history of science. The story begins in Hartford, Connecticut, in the year 1953. A young man named Henry Molaison was 27 years old, and for most of his life he had been living with a form of epilepsy so severe, so disruptive, so dangerous in its frequency and intensity that the ordinary shape of a life had been nearly impossible to maintain. The seizures came often and came hard. They had resisted every available treatment. And so Henry and his family arrived at what must have seemed like a last, serious option. A neurosurgeon named William Beecher Scoville, who had been experimenting with a procedure that targeted deep structures in the brain, structures that early clinical evidence suggested might be involved in generating the kind of seizures Henry had been suffering. Scoville proposed removing the hippocampus, both of them, the left side and the right side, bilaterally, along with surrounding tissue in a region called the medial temporal lobe. The surgery, in a narrow technical sense, worked. The seizures diminished. Henry survived. He came out of the anesthesia speaking clearly, recognizing the faces of the people he knew, able to hold a conversation, able to answer questions about his past, able to recall his childhood and his youth, and the years before the operating table. In every apparent way he seemed like himself. Then the days began to pass, and something became clear, slowly at first and then unmistakably, something that no one had anticipated and that no prior case in medicine had prepared anyone to understand. Henry could not form new memories. Each morning arrived as though it were the first morning. Each person he met was a stranger each time they met again. Each meal he ate was forgotten before the next one. He could be told something, genuinely receive and understand it, and 20 minutes later have no trace of it at all. The room he was in, the doctor standing before him, the conversation just completed, all of it vanished, with a completeness that was not like ordinary forgetting. It was something more total, something more like the experience simply not having happened. He was pleasant. He was cooperative. He was in many respects entirely himself. But the thread that connects one moment to the next, the thread that allows experience to accumulate into a continuous life, had been cut. A psychologist named Brenda Milner began working with Henry in the years that followed, and what she discovered, through careful, patient, systematic testing, reshaped everything that neuroscience thought it understood about how memory works. She tested him gently, methodically, returning session after session to a man who greeted her each time as someone he had never met. And one day she sat him down in front of a mirror and asked him to trace the outline of a 5-pointed star while looking only at its reflection. It is harder than it sounds. The mirror reverses everything. Your hand wants to move in one direction and the reflection tells you to move in the other, and the result, when you first try it, is a lurching, error-filled, frustrating experience. Henry tried it. He made errors. He struggled. And then he came back the next day, greeted Milner as a stranger, sat down again, and tried it again. And then he came back the day after that. What Milner found was that Henry got better. Session by session, his hand grew steadier, his tracing more accurate, the errors fewer. He was learning. The curve of improvement was exactly what you would expect to see in any person practicing a new skill, except that Henry had no memory of ever having practiced. Each time he sat down, the task was new to him. The pen was unfamiliar. The mirror was unfamiliar. The whole situation was something he was encountering for the first time, and yet his hands knew what to do. This finding cracked the concept of memory open. It revealed that what we call memory is not a single thing. It is not one system stored in one place and disrupted by one lesion. There appear to be at least 2 fundamentally different kinds of memory, drawing on different neural structures, following different rules. The kind that Henry had lost was the kind that allows you to consciously recall events, to remember that something happened, to know where you were and what you experienced. The kind that Henry retained was something different, a kind of knowing that lives in the body, in the practiced hand, in the sequence of movements that become automatic through repetition. You can call the first kind episodic memory. You can call the second kind procedural memory. And the hippocampus, it turned out, was essential to the first and apparently not to the second. The hippocampus sits deep in the temporal lobe, one on each side, curved and small, and for a long time it was tempting to think of it as a kind of vault, a place where memories were kept. But the picture that has emerged from decades of research since Henry is considerably stranger and, in its way, more elegant than that. The hippocampus does not appear to be a warehouse where memories live. It appears to function more like an index card in a library. The card does not contain the book. The card holds the address of the book, the location where the actual content can be retrieved, and without the card, the book might as well not exist because you have no way to find it. What this means is that the pieces of a memory, the visual detail, the sound, the smell, the emotional color, the sense of time and place, these are not all stored together in one location. They are distributed across the cortex, each fragment held in the region specialized to process that kind of information. The visual parts of a memory live near where visual processing happens. The auditory parts live near auditory cortex. The emotional resonance involves the amygdala, and the hippocampus, in a role that is still not entirely understood, somehow binds all of these scattered pieces together. It holds the pattern that tells the brain how to reassemble the fragments into something that feels like a unified moment. When you remember an afternoon from years ago, what you are doing is not retrieving a recording. You are reconstructing it. The hippocampus calls up the index, and the cortex finds the scattered pieces, and the brain assembles them back into an experience that feels, from the inside, like revisiting something real. This is what researchers sometimes call mental time travel. It is the capacity not merely to know that something happened, but to mentally re-inhabit the moment, to place yourself back inside it, to feel the quality of the light or the texture of the mood. This is what episodic memory is, and this is what Henry lost, not the facts of his past, which largely remained, but the ability to create new episodes, new moments that could be revisited later, new index cards that pointed to new experiences. It would be dishonest to suggest that all of this is settled. The exact mechanics of how the hippocampus binds distributed cortical patterns, the precise sequence by which experience becomes trace and trace becomes stable memory, these remain areas of active research and genuine scientific debate. The index card metaphor is useful but incomplete. The reality is almost certainly more dynamic, more interactive, more dependent on ongoing conversation between the hippocampus and the rest of the brain than any single analogy can capture. Memory science is one of the most active fields in all of neuroscience, and what Brenda Milner started by observing Henry trace a star in a mirror has grown into something vast and still unfinished. Henry Molaison spent the rest of his life in Massachusetts, cared for, cooperative, generous in his willingness to be studied. For decades, he participated in experiments, allowing researchers to probe the edges of what he could and could not retain, contributing to an understanding that has found its way into virtually every memory textbook ever written. He never knew this. He could not know it. Each session was the first session, each researcher a new face, each experiment something he had no recollection of having done before. He lived in an extended present that had no past accumulating behind it. He died in December of 2008, at the age of 82. His name was kept from the scientific literature until after his death, where he had appeared for decades simply as H.M., those two initials standing in for a life that quietly illuminated one of the most profound questions a human being can ask. What are we, if not our memories? What remains of a self when the thread of accumulated experience cannot be held? The answer that Henry offered, by simply continuing to live, to speak, to recognize kindness and respond to it, to improve at tasks his conscious mind had never encountered, was that something remains. Something essential and continuous and distinctly human persists even when the mechanism that stitches moments into a narrative is gone. What that something is, and where it lives, is a question that may never be fully answered. But the asking of it, the patient, careful, humane asking of it, is itself one of the more beautiful things the science of memory has ever done. There is a strange irony tucked inside the biology of memory, one that becomes more remarkable the longer you sit with it. The moments in your day that feel the most alive, the conversations, the decisions, the walk through a particular slant of afternoon light, those moments are not yet memories when they happen. They are something more like proposals, drafts, temporary impressions waiting to be confirmed. And the work that transforms them into something durable, something that might last the week or the decade, does not happen while you are awake and attending to your life. It happens, in large part, when you close your eyes and let the day go. The most important memory work of any given day takes place after the day is over. That is the paradox, and it is not a small one. The brain does not simply record as it goes, the way a camera captures frames. It encodes tentatively, and then it returns to what it has encoded, and it consolidates. It presses the impression deeper. It moves it from one kind of storage to another. And the machinery most responsible for that process runs at its highest capacity, while you are somewhere you cannot consciously observe it, suspended in sleep, breathing slowly, still. There are two distinct stages to this consolidation, and it helps to hold them separately in mind, even though they unfold along a continuum. The first happens quickly, within hours of an experience, and it happens at the level of the individual synapse, the small gap between one neuron and the next, where electrical signal jumps as chemical message. When you learn something new, the neurons involved in encoding that experience fire together, and that firing leaves a kind of structural echo. Proteins are synthesized. Receptor density at the synapse changes. The connection between the neurons involved is physically altered, made either stronger or more sensitive, so that the next time a related pattern of activity begins to unfold, the pathway is easier to travel. Think of it like a footprint pressed into wet concrete. The impression is there immediately. You can see it, read it, trace its outline, but the concrete has not hardened yet. For hours after the impression is made, it remains vulnerable. Disturb it before it sets, and the print is lost. In memory, the disturbance is not a passing foot, but a competing experience, an interruption, a new demand on the same neural circuits before the molecular machinery has had time to do its work. The proteins that need to be synthesized require time and quiet, and if they are denied that, the synapse does not change in the way it needs to. The footprint stays soft, and eventually it smooths away. This is why sleep, after learning, early sleep especially, tends to produce better retention than staying awake. It is not merely that sleep prevents interference, though it does that too. It is that sleep provides the metabolic and molecular conditions in which synaptic consolidation can complete itself undisturbed. But there is a second, slower, much larger process happening alongside and after the first, and this is the one that operates over weeks and months and sometimes years. Researchers call it system consolidation, and it concerns not the synapse but the architecture of the whole brain, specifically the long, gradual transfer of memories from a structure that holds them temporarily, the hippocampus, into the distributed networks of the cortex, where they eventually come to live on their own. When you first encode an experience, the hippocampus is essential to retrieving it. Damage the hippocampus early, as was so dramatically demonstrated by the story told in the previous section, and recent memories vanish. But given enough time, given enough sleep, given enough repetition and replay, many memories seem to become independent of the hippocampus. They migrate, slowly, into cortical networks that can hold them without the hippocampal index card. They become, in a sense, native to the cortex. This is why very old memories often survive hippocampal damage when recent ones do not. The migration for those older memories has already completed. They are settled into their permanent homes. The question of how this migration happens, how the hippocampus orchestrates the slow transfer of information into distributed cortical networks, is one that researchers have been pursuing with great intensity. And some of the most compelling evidence came not from human patients but from rats, running mazes in the dark. In the early 1990s, a neuroscientist named Matt Wilson, working at the time at the University of Arizona, was recording from neurons in the hippocampi of rats as they moved through a maze. These neurons, called place cells, had a remarkable property that had been identified years earlier by John O'Keefe. Each cell fired preferentially when the animal occupied a particular location in space. As the rat moved through the maze, different place cells activated in sequence, firing in an order that mapped the animal's journey through physical space like a neural transcript of the route. What Wilson and his colleagues discovered in 1994 changed how researchers thought about sleep and memory permanently. When the rats fell asleep after running the maze, the same place cells that had fired during waking navigation began to fire again, and they did it in the same sequence. The sleeping brain was replaying the day's experience, not randomly, not chaotically, but in an ordered fashion that preserved the temporal structure of what had actually happened. The hippocampus, during slow-wave sleep especially, appeared to be rehearsing the route, running the memory through itself again and again, like a musician practicing a passage in a quiet room long after the audience has gone home. This finding, and the decades of research it inspired, painted a picture of slow-wave sleep as a period of active memory consolidation. During the deep, slow oscillations of non-REM sleep, the hippocampus appears to replay fragments of recent experience, and these replays are thought to gradually transfer the memory traces outward, prompting the cortex to strengthen the connections that will eventually hold the memory independently. Then comes REM sleep, the phase associated with vivid dreaming, with the rapid movement of eyes beneath closed lids, with a brain that on an EEG looks almost indistinguishable from waking. REM seems to play a different role than slow-wave sleep, not so much the initial consolidation of individual memories, but something more integrative, more associative. During REM, the brain appears to be less concerned with stamping down specific traces and more concerned with finding the connections between them. New memories are being held up against old ones. Patterns are being identified. Emotional context is being assigned. A new experience is being woven into the fabric of everything that has come before. Think of it this way. The memory of a new piece of information arrives at the brain the way a new book arrives at a library. When it first comes in, it sits near the entrance, logged but not yet shelved, not yet integrated into the collection. The cataloging system has noted its existence, but it is not yet part of the working library. You cannot yet find it by browsing the stacks. During the night, during the slow oscillations of deep sleep and the associative wandering of REM, the library staff, so to speak, works through the night. By morning, the book is shelved. It is in its place among related titles. You can find it not only by remembering where it was put, but by following the threads of subject and theme that connect it to everything else you know. Now, there is something important to say carefully here. The connection between dreaming and memory consolidation is real and actively studied, but it remains scientifically unfinished. It would be a step too far to say that dreams are necessary for memory, or that the content of dreams maps directly onto what the sleeping brain is consolidating. The relationship between the subjective experience of dreaming and the underlying neural processes of memory replay and integration is still being worked out. What researchers are more confident about is that the sleep states themselves, slow wave and REM, serve important functions for memory, and that the consolidation happening during them is genuine and consequential. What the dreaming mind is doing while all that consolidation proceeds is a question that remains genuinely open, and it is the kind of question that deserves more humility than certainty. What is clear is that each morning you wake from sleep, you are waking into a brain that has been quietly working. The traces laid down the day before are more stable than they were at dusk. The new information has been moved further from the temporary holding area of the hippocampus and further into the broader architecture of long-term storage. The wet concrete has hardened a little more. The library has done its overnight shelving. And all of this, the synaptic changes, the replay, the slow migration from hippocampus to cortex, all of it concerns memory in the sense of what persists, what can be retrieved tomorrow or next year. But the brain faces another memory problem that is quite different in character. The problem of this moment, right now, the handful of things you are holding in mind as you read or listen, the thread you are following as one sentence becomes the next. That kind of immediate, working, present-tense memory operates through a system that is remarkably compact, surprisingly fragile, and in its limits, extraordinarily revealing. And that is where this story goes next. Long-term memory, as you have been hearing, is immense. It is a structure of almost unimaginable capacity, holding everything from the smell of a childhood kitchen to the conjugation rules of a language you learned decades ago, from the face of someone you loved to the procedure for tying a particular kind of knot. It is deep and dark and vast, the way an ocean is vast, with most of its contents well below the surface at any given moment, existing in the quiet of potential rather than the noise of active use. But there is another kind of memory entirely, and it is where you actually live. It is the place where thinking happens, where sentences are assembled and held while they are being understood, where problems are turned over and examined, where this word and the next and the one after that are being woven into meaning. Researchers call it working memory, and if long-term memory is an ocean, working memory is a small, brightly lit desk beside it. The desk is where the work gets done, but the desk is very small. In 1974, two British psychologists named Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch proposed a model of working memory that became one of the most influential frameworks in all of cognitive science, not because it was immediately complete, but because it captured something true about the architecture of the thinking mind. They described working memory not as a single holding tank, but as a system with distinct components that could operate in parallel, each one responsible for a different kind of temporary mental work. One of those components, Baddeley and Hitch called the phonological loop. You can feel it operating right now if you attend carefully. It is something like an inner ear, a small cycle of sound-based rehearsal that keeps verbal information alive in your mind by running it through itself repeatedly. When you look up a phone number and then walk to another room to dial it, whispering it to yourself as you go, that is the phonological loop doing its work. It holds the number not by writing it anywhere, but by looping it, repeating the sounds in the right order, keeping them from fading. Stop rehearsing for even a few seconds and the number is gone. The loop is fragile, but while it is running, it is remarkably effective at its narrow task. The second component they described was the visuospatial sketchpad, something more like an inner eye. When you try to remember the layout of a room you have just left, or mentally rotate an object to see what it looks like from the other side, or trace in your mind the route from one place to another, you are using the sketchpad. It holds not sounds and words, but shapes, positions, arrangements in space. The loop and the sketchpad run somewhat independently of each other, which is why you can listen to spoken language and navigate visually at the same time, though only up to a point. Presiding over both of these, Baddeley and Hitch proposed a third element, they called the central executive. The name is almost comically bureaucratic for something so important. The central executive is the part of working memory that decides where attention goes, that shifts focus between tasks, that coordinates the loop and the sketchpad, that suppresses irrelevant information so that relevant information has room to breathe. If the loop is a voice running through sounds and the sketchpad is a hand sketching shapes, the central executive is the tired, overworked manager who has to decide which of the two gets priority in any given moment, and who has to do that deciding while also trying to think. What makes working memory remarkable is not its sophistication, it is its smallness. A psychologist named George Miller published a paper in 1956 with one of the most memorably specific titles in the history of science. He called it The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2, and what it described was the capacity limit of short-term working memory. The mind, Miller found, can hold roughly 7 items at once. Some people can manage 9, some struggle past 5, but the range is narrow and the ceiling is real. Try it yourself, lightly. Think of a 7-digit phone number, the kind people memorized before the numbers were all stored elsewhere. 7 digits. Say them once in your head. Now do not repeat them. Notice how quickly the sense of holding them begins to slip, how the sequence starts to blur at the edges. That fading feeling is not a failure of concentration. It is the phonological loop reaching the edge of what it can sustain. The desk is small. 7 items is close to all it holds, and if the items are long, or unfamiliar, or arrive faster than the loop can cycle through them, even 7 becomes ambitious. But here is the part that becomes genuinely beautiful when you follow it carefully. What counts as an item is not fixed. It depends on what you know. In the 1970s, a psychologist named William Chase and a chess grandmaster named Herbert Simon sat down to study how chess players perceive the board. They showed novice players and expert players the same chess positions for 5 seconds, and then asked them to reconstruct the arrangement from memory. The novices could recall the position of only a handful of pieces. The experts could reconstruct almost the entire board. The obvious interpretation is that the experts simply had better memories. But that was not it. When Chase and Simon showed both groups a board where the pieces were arranged randomly, with no relationship to any actual game, the experts did no better than the novices. The expertise was not raw memory capacity. It was something else entirely. What the masters were doing was seeing the board differently. A novice looks at 32 pieces and sees 32 separate things to hold in mind. An expert looks at the same board and sees 6 or 7 recognizable configurations, clusters of pieces that form familiar patterns from thousands of hours of play. The knight protecting the queen while the rook controls an open file is not 3 items. It is 1, because the expert knows it as a single, meaningful unit. The board has been compressed. The same information has been packed into fewer, richer containers. This is chunking, and it is one of the most important things working memory does to extend its own reach. A chunk is a unit of information that has been bound together through familiarity into something that functions as a single item. The letters C, A, and T take 3 slots in working memory if you have never seen them before. But the word cat takes 1 slot because you know it. The sentence takes even fewer slots proportionally because grammar gives structure and structure compresses. Expertise in any domain is in part the long, slow accumulation of chunks that allow more information to fit within the fixed ceiling of working memory. Think of it as a filing cabinet with a limited number of drawers. A novice arrives at the cabinet with loose papers in both hands. Every page is a separate piece of information they must keep hold of while trying to think. The papers slip. They drop one while picking up another. The hands can only grip so many at once. An expert arrives at the same cabinet with pre-labeled folders, each one containing dozens of related pages, filed by a system they built over years of practice. The same number of drawers, the same hands, but the expert can manage vastly more because the information has already been organized before it ever reaches the workspace. You can feel the difference in cognitive load when the system is overwhelmed. Cognitive load is the term researchers use for the degree to which working memory is being taxed. Imagine you are cooking something unfamiliar, a recipe with many steps in an unfamiliar order, ingredients added at precise intervals, timing that requires attention. You are holding the sequence in mind, monitoring the pan, tracking the clock. Then someone comes into the kitchen and starts talking to you, not about something trivial, about something that requires a real response. The cognitive demand collides. You lose your place in the recipe. The sentence they are saying does not fully register. You may smile and nod while understanding almost nothing of what was said. That is not rudeness. That is the desk being too small. Working memory does not expand under pressure. It simply spills. And here, just for a moment, let the ideas rest where they are. Notice how the body has grown heavier in the time you have been listening, how the shoulders have settled a little further, how the thinking has gone slightly softer at its edges. You do not need to hold any of this. The information will find its place. The library staff is already preparing for the night's work. Just let the next ideas arrive without gripping them, the way you would let sounds drift through an open window. If working memory is this small, this finite, this easily overwhelmed, and long-term memory is as vast and deep as everything you have heard so far, then a question emerges quietly from the gap between them. Things enter the mind all day long. Sensations, words, faces, ideas, all of it passing through, and yet so much of it disappears. The vast ocean is right there, but the transfer from that bright little desk to the deep shelves beyond is neither automatic nor reliable. So why, when the system is so large and the mind so hungry for information, do we forget so much of what we touch? The answer that comes first, the intuitive one, is that forgetting is a failure, a deficit, something the system does wrong, or does not do well enough. We speak of forgetting this way in ordinary life. We forget an appointment and apologize. We forget a name and feel embarrassed. We forget what we went upstairs to retrieve and stand in the hallway with a mild sense of bewilderment, as if the mind has let us down. The language we use around forgetting is almost always the language of inadequacy. But that framing, comfortable and common as it is, turns out to be almost exactly backwards. There is a story by the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges about a young man named Funes who, after an accident, finds that he can no longer forget anything. Not a single perception, not a single moment. Every leaf he has ever seen, individually remembered, every time he has seen it, in every particular light, from every particular angle, every face, every sound, every sensation, arriving with the same weight and clarity as every other, nothing fading, nothing receding, nothing compressing into the useful blur of the general. Borges wrote the story as a kind of thought experiment, and the conclusion it reaches is not a fantasy of perfect recall. It is a portrait of paralysis. Funes cannot think in categories because categories require forgetting the differences between things in order to see what they share. He cannot sleep easily because sleep requires the loosening of attention, and attention for him never loosens. He spends his nights in a darkened room overwhelmed by the weight of everything he has ever known, each memory, as vivid as the moment it arrived. The story is fiction, but the cognitive insight embedded in it is not. A mind that retains everything with equal fidelity is not a more capable mind. It is a mind that cannot abstract, cannot generalize, cannot function at the level of meaning rather than detail. Forgetting is not the enemy of thought. In a very real sense, forgetting is what makes thought possible. When researchers began looking more carefully at what actually happens during forgetting, they found that many instances of apparent forgetting are not about information being erased. They are about information becoming inaccessible due to competition. The term for one form of this is proactive interference, and it works like this. Old memories, the ones already well established in the network, can crowd out new information that resembles them. Think of someone who has spoken one language fluently for years and then begins learning a second. When they reach for the new word, the old language is there first, faster, more practiced, pressing forward before the new acquisition has found its footing. Or think of phone numbers. If you memorized a phone number for a place you called regularly for years, and the number was then changed, the old number does not simply clear itself away to make room. It competes. You dial the old one. You have to consciously suppress it in order to reach for the new one, the past reaching forward into the present and interfering with it. Then there is the reverse, which is called retroactive interference, and it moves in the opposite direction. New learning disrupts what was previously known. Study a list of words, then study a different list of similar words, and the second list will impair your ability to recall the first. Learn a second language to a high level, and it begins to erode some of the automatic fluency of the first. The new presses backward into the old. Two things that are similar enough to share the same territory in the network compete for occupancy, and the result is that both become somewhat less accessible than either would have been alone. This means that forgetting, in these cases, is not a simple emptying out. It is the consequence of a system that stores by association, and therefore stores by competition. The library shelves are arranged by theme, and when two books are placed on the same shelf, finding one quickly can mean briefly losing sight of the other. But there is another kind of forgetting that is even more interesting, because the information in this case has not been displaced by anything. It is simply temporarily unreachable. You will recognize this from your own experience. A word you know perfectly well, a name, a title, the term for something you have used 100 times, sits just beyond your grasp. You know that you know it. You can almost feel its shape. You can sometimes sense how many syllables it has, what letter it might begin with, what it rhymes with or does not rhyme with. The word is there. The memory is present, but the retrieval path, the thread you normally follow from the question to the answer, is not quite engaging. Researchers call this the tip of the tongue state, and it is one of the stranger experiences memory produces, because it is a simultaneous awareness of knowing and not knowing. The best way to picture it is to imagine a key and a lock that belong together. The key is the right key. It fits. But the lock has shifted very slightly in its housing, just a fraction of a degree off alignment, and the key catches without turning. Then something happens. A related word floats into mind. Someone says a word nearby that rhymes with it. The context shifts. A different angle of approach becomes available, and suddenly the lock turns. The word arrives as if it had simply been waiting. It was always there. The path to it was the thing that needed to find its footing. This is retrieval failure, and it matters enormously for how we understand the reliability of memory. Because if so much forgetting is actually blocked access rather than lost content, then what we remember at any moment is not a stable inventory of everything we know. It is whatever happens to be reachable along the paths currently available. Memory is not a filing cabinet whose contents are fixed. It is more like a city you navigate by routes, and some routes are temporarily closed, some are crowded, some have simply not been traveled in so long that the path has grown over. Now here is where the story takes a turn that unsettles the whole picture in a quiet, important way. For a long time, the assumption in memory research was that once a memory had been consolidated, once it had moved from that fragile early state into long-term storage, it was stable, encoded, filed. Whatever you retrieved was a copy of the original, not the original itself. But beginning in the late 1990s, research in animals began to suggest something more disquieting. When a memory is retrieved, when it is brought back into active awareness, it does not simply play back and then return unchanged to storage. It enters a brief period of instability. It must be consolidated again, restabilized, before it settles back into the network. And during that window, it is open to change. This process is called reconsolidation, and its implications ripple outward in every direction. If every act of remembering destabilizes the memory being remembered, even slightly, then each recall is not a neutral reading of a fixed record. It is also a writing event. The memory returns to storage after being retrieved, but what returns is not necessarily identical to what was retrieved. It has been touched by the context of the retrieval, the mood of the moment, the questions that were being asked when it was called up, the things that were noticed this time that were not noticed the last time. Think of it this way. A memory is not a photograph in an album, fixed on paper, identical every time you lift the cover. A memory is a performance. You are not reading the lines from a printed page. You are performing them, and every performance involves interpretation. The emphasis shifts slightly. A gesture changes. A word is delivered with a different weight. And here is the consequence. Each performance is also a recording, layered on top of all the previous performances. And eventually, the performance is what you remember, not the original event that first prompted all this activity. The science around reconsolidation in humans is careful to acknowledge its own limits. The phenomenon is well established in animal models, particularly in rodents, where the manipulation of memory during its unstable post-retrieval window can be demonstrated cleanly, even dramatically. In humans, the picture is murkier. The same crisp results are harder to produce consistently, and researchers continue to debate how reliably and under what conditions reconsolidation shapes human memory. The principle is sound. The details of how far it reaches in ordinary human recall remain open. But even held at arm's length, the implication is worth sitting with quietly, here in the dark, in this slow-moving hour. Remembering changes what you remember. Every time you return to something, you are also, in some small way, rewriting it, not with intention, not with awareness. But the past is not behind a sealed door. It is a living document, touched each time you open it, shaped by who you are now when you go looking for who you were then. And nowhere does this become more layered, more tangled, more achingly complex than in the memories that carry the most weight. The ones that feel most certain, most permanent, most vivid, the ones charged from the beginning with the deepest feeling. There is a paradox at the center of emotional memory, and it is one of the more quietly troubling things that memory science has uncovered. The memories you feel most certain about, the ones that come with a sense of indelible clarity, a sense that this one you could not possibly misremember because it was simply too important, too vivid, too seared into you, are often the very memories that have traveled furthest from what actually took place. The emotional intensity that makes a memory feel permanent is not the same force that makes it accurate. In fact, the two can work against each other in ways that take some time to understand. To understand why, you have to go deeper into the brain's architecture, into the relationship between two structures that are neighbors but not equals in moments of high arousal. The hippocampus, which you have been spending time with throughout this long night, handles the binding and initial consolidation of episodic memory. It weaves together the who, the what, the where, the when, but sitting close beside it is a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala, and its role in memory is less like a librarian and more like a volume dial. When you experience something emotionally charged, something that registers as frightening, shocking, deeply sad, or unexpectedly wonderful, the amygdala responds immediately. It releases signals, chemical and electrical, that essentially lean across to the hippocampus and say, "This one matters. Encode this more deeply. Hold it longer." This is sensible design. From the perspective of survival across evolutionary time, the events most worth remembering are precisely the ones attached to strong feeling. The place where danger appeared, the sound that preceded harm, the face associated with threat, a memory system that recorded emotionally neutral events as reliably as emotionally charged ones would be squandering resources. The amygdala acts as a prioritization signal, ensuring that high arousal experiences are consolidated with particular strength. The complication is that deeper consolidation and more accurate consolidation are not the same thing. The amygdala amplifies. It does not fact-check. Joseph Ledoux, a neuroscientist who spent decades mapping how the brain processes fear, described how the emotional brain can respond to threatening stimuli with striking speed, routing through pathways that reach the amygdala before the cortex has fully processed what is being seen or heard. His research pointed toward the possibility that something like a fast, rough emotional response could precede conscious awareness, a signal that gets the body preparing before the mind has finished evaluating. Ledoux was careful, and has since been even more careful, to note that the popular description of a separate, entirely unconscious fear pathway, the so-called low road, as a fully established and cleanly separate system, has been simplified beyond what the evidence reliably shows. The broader picture is genuinely complex, but the core insight holds. Emotional arousal and memory consolidation are intimately connected, and the brain prioritizes the emotional signal even at the cost of precision elsewhere. You can feel this with something as simple as a small fright. Imagine you are walking in the evening, and you step around a garden wall, and a dog lunges at a fence you did not know was there. Later, you remember the dog. You remember the lunge, the sound, the shock of adrenaline in your chest. What you may not remember accurately is how many steps you had taken, what you were thinking about a moment before, exactly what the fence looked like, which direction you were facing. The emotional center held, the peripheral details scattered. Now expand that principle outward, to events not just personal but collective, moments when an entire society receives a shock at the same moment, and the memory phenomenon becomes something researchers have studied with genuine fascination. They are called flashbulb memories, a term introduced by the psychologists Roger Brown and James Kulik in 1977. The name captures the subjective experience precisely. When something enormous and unexpected happens in the world, a shocking public event, an assassination, a disaster, a moment of sudden national or global rupture, the memory of where you were when you heard the news forms with what feels like photographic clarity. People describe these memories in exactly those terms. I can see it exactly as it was. I remember every detail. I know precisely where I was standing, what I was doing. who told me, what I said when I heard it. The memories feel like snapshots, and for a long time, it was assumed they essentially were, that the emotional intensity of the moment had effectively burned the details in place. Then Ulrich Neisser and Nicole Harsch studied them carefully. In the days immediately following the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in January 1986, they collected written accounts from students describing exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. Then, 2.5 years later, they went back to those same students and asked them to recall the same moment again. They also checked the new accounts against the original written ones from days after the event. The results were striking, not because the memories had faded, but because they had changed while remaining vivid. Students confidently described being in places they had not been. They recalled hearing the news from people who had not told them. They remembered emotional responses that did not match their original accounts. And here is the most important part. As the time between the event and the recall increased, the confidence in the memory increased as well. The memories had drifted substantially. The feeling of certainty had not drifted at all. In some cases it had grown. This is the paradox made visible and measurable. The emotional intensity that made the memory feel permanent was the same force that, over time, allowed it to be quietly reconstructed, touched by reconsolidation events, shaped by what was discussed afterward, influenced by news coverage and collective retelling, all of it settling into a story that felt absolutely first-hand, absolutely true, even when it disagreed at multiple points with the written account from 3 years earlier. Vividness, it turns out, is a feeling that the memory system attaches to certain experiences. It is not a stamp of verification. It is not evidence that the record is intact. This becomes even more important and requires even more care when the emotional charge involved is not shock or surprise, but genuine fear and threat extended over time. When someone experiences something deeply frightening, the amygdala's influence on memory shifts in another direction. Research on trauma, careful and ongoing and not fully settled, suggests that under extreme threat, the brain's encoding process can become uneven in a particular way. The details most directly associated with the threat, the face, the sound, the sensation, the specific object of danger, may be encoded with exceptional force. The surrounding context, the sequence of events, the broader narrative frame may be encoded poorly or in fragments. This can result in memories that are vivid but incomplete, intense but without clear borders, returning not smoothly in sequence but in pieces, arriving without the normal contextual wrapping that allows a memory to be placed precisely in the past. A fragmented memory can feel present in a way that an ordinary memory does not, because ordinary memories come packaged with signals that identify them as past. Something has gone wrong with the packaging, and what should feel like a recollection instead feels immediate. None of this is said here to explain or diagnose or prescribe. It is said only to help illuminate something that memory science has been slowly clarifying, which is that the experience of a memory, its emotional weight, its sense of brightness and realness, does not tell you the shape of what happened. It tells you the shape of how the brain responded to what happened. Those two things are related. They are not the same. The memories that carry the most feeling are the ones the system treated as most important. The system did its job, but importance is not accuracy. Depth of encoding is not fidelity of encoding, and the more often a memory is returned to, revisited, spoken about, worked over in the quiet hours, the more opportunities there have been for small changes to enter it, each one invisible, each one carrying its own small certainty. Vividness is a feeling. It is a real and meaningful feeling. It tells you something true about how the moment was registered, but it is not a certificate. It is not proof that the image matches the original, and if all of this is unsettling, it becomes more so when you follow this thread just a little further, because everything we have been exploring, the constructive nature of memory, its susceptibility to context and mood and suggestion, its willingness to be quietly rewritten each time it is retrieved, leads somewhere that initially seems impossible. It leads to the strange and documented territory of memories that feel just as vivid, just as certain, just as charged with the textures of lived experience as any other memory you carry, except that they describe events that never occurred, things you remember clearly that simply did not happen. What would it mean to remember something that never happened, not vaguely, not as a blur you are not quite sure of, but with full sensory presence, with the smell of the room and the quality of the light, with the feeling of your own body in that moment, with the certainty that comes only from having been there? Not a dream you have confused for a waking event, not a story someone told you that you have absorbed as experience, a memory, yours, vivid, emotionally true, and factually, demonstrably, never having occurred. This is not a hypothetical. It has been studied, documented, and replicated across decades and populations. And the person whose work made this clearest, whose research shifted how courts and clinicians and cognitive scientists think about human memory, is a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus. Loftus began this line of inquiry in the early 1970s with an approach that was quietly revolutionary in its simplicity. She showed participants short films of traffic accidents, ordinary collisions, cars moving, impact, the aftermath. Then she asked questions about what they had seen, and she varied the questions in ways that seemed minor, but turned out to matter enormously. When she asked participants how fast the cars were going when they contacted each other, she got one kind of answer. When she asked how fast they were going when they smashed into each other, she got a different answer. The same film, the same event, just a different verb. The smashed group estimated significantly higher speeds than the contacted group. This alone would have been interesting. But then Loftus went a step further. A week later, with no film shown, she asked participants whether they had seen any broken glass in the accident footage. There had been no broken glass, yet the participants who had been asked the smashed question were considerably more likely to report having seen it. The word smashed had not just changed their estimate in the moment of answering, it had entered the memory itself. A new detail, one that was never there, had been quietly written in. This is what researchers came to call the misinformation effect. Information introduced after an event, embedded in a question, a comment, a casual retelling, can become incorporated into the memory of the event. Not remembered alongside the event as a separate piece of information, but absorbed into the original trace, indistinguishable from what was actually experienced. The post-event information does not sit outside the memory and color it. It enters the memory and becomes it. The implications were significant enough that Loftus spent decades extending the research in every direction she could find. And in 1995, working with colleagues, she published a study that remains one of the most discussed and debated in all of memory science. The design was straightforward, and its results were unsettling in a very specific way. Participants were given a small booklet containing brief descriptions of childhood events, presented as accounts gathered from their family members. Most of the events were real, drawn from genuine family recollections. But one event in each booklet was entirely fabricated. It described the participant having become lost in a shopping mall as a young child, being frightened and separated from family, and eventually being helped by a stranger before being reunited. None of it had happened. The family members had confirmed this and had helped construct the false account. Participants were then asked over multiple sessions to think about each event, try to remember it, and write down whatever came to them. A meaningful proportion of participants, in some analyses around a quarter to a third, came to report memories of the mall event, not just willingness to accept that it might have happened. Actual memories, details, the feeling of the stranger's hand, the fear, the relief, their own small body in a large, unfamiliar place. Memories that carried the signature of experience and that the participants were often reluctant to release, even when told, at the end of the study, that the event had been invented. Think of memory not as a private journal that only you can write in, but as something closer to a shared document, a page that can be edited by any number of contributors over time, by what you were told before the event, by how you were questioned after it, by the stories others told about you in your presence, by the cultural scripts you had already absorbed about what certain experiences are supposed to feel like, by your own attempts to fill gaps with what probably happened, what logically would have happened, what someone like you, in a moment like that, would have done and felt and seen. The page is never locked, the revision history is invisible, and every version feels like the original. This is not a flaw that separates unreliable people from reliable ones. It is not a sign of weakness or suggestibility in any simple sense. It is the architecture, the same system that allows you to learn from experience, to update your understanding, to integrate new information into existing knowledge. That same system does not draw a clean line between what you originally encoded and what you have added since. It cannot. The mechanisms of learning and the mechanisms of memory are deeply intertwined. And so it matters enormously when that architecture is placed inside a courtroom. Eyewitness testimony has historically been treated as among the most persuasive forms of evidence available. The witness was there, the witness saw it, the witness is certain, but the research has accumulated steadily and carefully over decades, and its message has become difficult to ignore. The certainty a witness feels does not reliably indicate the accuracy of what is remembered. Identification confidence, which is how sure someone feels pointing to a face in a lineup, has a weaker relationship to identification accuracy than most people, including most jurors, tend to assume. The Innocence Project, a legal nonprofit that has worked for decades to overturn wrongful convictions through DNA evidence, has documented case after case in which eyewitness misidentification was a contributing factor. The details of each case are different, the circumstances are complex, and the science continues to be refined. But the broad pattern is consistent with what the laboratory research would predict. Memory, especially memory retrieved under the conditions of a police interview or courtroom proceeding, under stress and time pressure, shaped by the framing of questions and the expectations of the setting, is not a recording played back for an audience. It is a reconstruction assembled under conditions that may be shaping it in ways the witness cannot detect and would not believe. And here, at this edge of what seems like an alarming discovery, it is worth pausing, breathing quietly, and choosing to find in this something other than fear. Because the brain is not failing when this happens. It is doing what it has always done, which is to build the most coherent and useful story it can from incomplete materials. The fragments arrive, the gaps are filled, the narrative closes, and the feeling of that closure, the sense of a whole, remembered world, is offered to consciousness as experience. Your mind is doing this right now, in a gentler register, stitching together the half-images that drift behind your eyelids, filling the silence between words with something soft and unformed, writing small stories from the day's remaining threads and letting them dissolve before they are finished. You do not need to hold any of this. You do not need to keep track of what the brain is building or whether it is accurate or where it is going. Let the mind make its stories from whatever fragments float up. Let them take whatever shape they want. Let them pass through without annotation, without review. This is what the sleeping mind does beautifully, and you are already partway there. Because what Loftus and those who followed her were really revealing was not a malfunction. It was the nature of the thing itself. Memory is not a document that records events the way a camera records light. It is a story that a storytelling system tells, and like all stories, it is shaped by who is doing the telling, and when, and what they already believe, and who is in the room, and what they seem to want to hear, and what the story needs to mean for the day to make sense. The past, then, as you carry it, is not a fixed thing. It is living material. It has been shaped by every retrieval, every conversation, every quiet hour of revisitation, every question anyone ever asked you about it. It belongs to you completely, and it is also, in a very real sense, never quite finished. Memory is not a record. It is a story. And like all stories, it changes depending on who is telling it and when. And that story has a beginning you cannot find. Most people, when they turn their attention toward the earliest edges of their life, discover a kind of fog, not a fog that lifts, but one that simply ends, as if the world before a certain point did not exist, or existed for someone else. There are photographs, perhaps. There are things people have told you about yourself, things your parents described with warmth or laughter or careful repetition, until those descriptions became something you almost remember but do not quite. You were there for all of it, years of days, mornings and nights, faces and sounds and the specific quality of light in rooms you have not stood in since, and almost none of it is retrievable as experience. Almost none of it waits for you on the other side of any door. This is called infantile amnesia, and for decades it seemed like a strange puzzle. Infants and toddlers are clearly learning, clearly building knowledge about the world, clearly forming attachments that will shape them in lasting ways. And yet the episodic record, the autobiographical thread of what happened to me, at this time, in this place, is largely absent for the first 3 or 4 years of life. Not because the experiences were not real, not because they failed to matter, but because the brain structures responsible for binding those experiences into durable narrative had not yet developed the connections they would need to do that work. So, the hippocampus, which you have come to know across these quiet hours as the great indexer of declarative memory, is still maturing in those early years. Its connections to the language system, to the frontal regions that support self-referential thought, to the broader cortical network that allows an experience to be woven into a story a person can later tell. Those connections are not yet in place, and without them, experience can influence, can shape, can leave its mark in the body and in behavior, and in the implicit architecture of who a child is becoming, but it cannot write itself into the kind of retrievable personal history that will still be there at 40, waiting to be recalled. The filing system exists. The indexer is growing, but the conditions for autobiography have not yet been met. What emerges instead, for most people, is a handful of fragments from around age 3 or 4, isolated and luminous, disconnected from before and after, floating without context. A room very bright, a voice, a feeling of being very small in a large space. These fragments are not the whole record. They are only the pieces that happen to crystallize at the moment when the structures were just becoming capable of holding them. And then the years accumulate, and something curious happens in them. If you ask adults across many different cultures and life situations to describe their most vivid, most personally significant memories, the memories that feel most like their own, a pattern emerges with striking regularity. Those memories tend to cluster around a particular window of life. The years from roughly 15 to 25 carry a disproportionate share of what researchers call the reminiscence bump, a concentration of memorable experience that is too consistent and too widespread to be coincidence. The reasons for this clustering are likely several, working together. These are years of first experiences, and novelty is one of the conditions memory finds most favorable. The first time a thing happens, the brain has no existing framework to assimilate it into, so it encodes it more fully, more vividly, with more of the emotional texture intact. Alongside novelty, there is emotional salience. Adolescence and early adulthood are periods of heightened intensity when the stakes of identity feel enormous and when the nervous system responds to experience with a depth that may itself be a product of developmental biology. And then there is the question of self. These are the years when identity is being formed, when a person is asking, sometimes urgently, who am I and who will I become? Memories that arrive during that process of self-construction may attach themselves more firmly to the self, because the self needs them, is actively using them, is building itself in part out of them. So the story of a life in memory is not evenly written. The first chapters are largely missing. The middle chapters, the ones from those identity-forming years, are bright and unusually detailed. And then the decades that follow are also present, also held, but in a quieter register, with perhaps more compression, more summary, more knowing what happened without quite seeing it anymore. In the middle years of adult life, changes begin to occur that are real and measurable, though easy to misread. Processing speed, which is the rate at which the brain can move information through its systems, begins a slow and gradual decline. Working memory, the mental workspace where information is held and manipulated moment to moment, becomes somewhat smaller and less efficient. These changes are not dramatic, not sudden, not the same in everyone, and they do not mean that learning has stopped or that intelligence is diminishing. Semantic memory, the vast storehouse of knowledge and meaning that accumulates across a lifetime, tends to remain stable, and in many cases continues to grow. Crystallized knowledge, the kind built from decades of experience and reflection, often reaches its fullest expression in middle age and beyond. What changes is more like the speed of access than the depth of the store. And in older age this continues. Retrieval becomes slower, not because the memories have gone, but because the retrieval pathways have become less efficient, like roads that are still there but require more time to travel. The tip of the tongue state, that peculiar and somewhat maddening experience of knowing you know something while being temporarily unable to surface it, becomes more frequent. Interference from other memories, from similar words or names or experiences that crowd in around the target, becomes more of an obstacle. In a world of constant demand and quick response, these changes can feel alarming, but it is important to hold them clearly. Normal age-related memory changes are inconvenient. They require patience. They ask for more time, more repetition, more deliberate effort. They are not a sign that the brain is failing. They are not early dementia. They are the natural trajectory of a system that has been running for decades, processing an almost incomprehensible volume of experience, and that continues to work, continues to learn, continues to hold the accumulated substance of an entire life. Alzheimer's disease is something different in kind, not merely in degree. It is a neurodegenerative process, a disease in the biological sense, that begins its damage in specific structures. The entorhinal cortex, which serves as one of the primary gateways into the hippocampus, is typically among the first regions affected. The hippocampus itself follows, and because these are the structures responsible for encoding new episodic memories, for registering what happened today and yesterday and last week. Those recent memories are the first to become unavailable. The more distant past, the decades-old experiences that have long since been consolidated into cortical networks, the childhood home, the faces of people loved long ago, the procedural knowledge of how to do familiar things, these are protected for longer, stored in structures that the disease reaches later. Imagine a large library, its shelves stretching back deep into the building, holding volumes accumulated across many years. The newest arrivals, just catalogued, sit closest to the entrance. And at that entrance, water is slowly seeping in. The books nearest the door are the first to be damaged, the first to become illegible. The further back you move, into the older collections, the drier the air, the safer the shelves. For a time, a long time, the oldest volumes remain intact, while the recent acquisitions are lost. This is what the disease does to the library of a life. It is not forgetfulness in the normal sense. It is not retrieval difficulty or processing slowdown. It is the loss of the mechanisms that write new entries into the record at all. And in time, as the water rises, it moves deeper, reaching collections that once seemed safely distant. To know the difference between this and normal aging is not to be frightened on behalf of everyone who misplaces a name or loses a thought mid-sentence. It is to hold the genuine distinction with both clarity and compassion. Most people who worry about their memory are experiencing the normal arc of a brain moving through time. They are not losing themselves. They are finding that the self requires more patience, more accommodation, more deliberate care. And what this whole arc of memory, from the invisible beginnings of infancy to the long accumulation of a life, suggests, is something worth resting in. We are not static things holding a fixed record. We are processes, changing, growing, consolidating, sometimes losing access to what we once held, and somehow remaining recognizably ourselves through all of it. That continuity, through all the forgetting and revising and losing and recovering, is one of the quieter wonders of the mind that carries you through every day and carries you now, gently, into rest. The brain has never been meant to hold everything alone. Long before anyone understood how memory worked, long before anyone had language for what the hippocampus does, or why sleep matters, or how a single question can reshape what a witness believes they saw, human beings were doing something quietly remarkable. They were reaching outward. They were extending themselves into the world, pressing the record of their experience into surfaces that would hold what the mind might eventually lose. 30,000 years ago, in the darkness of a cave in southern France, someone pressed their hand against stone and blew pigment around it. They painted bison and aurochs in ochre and charcoal, left marks that were not merely decorative. They were storing something. They were saying, this was here, this mattered, this should not be lost. The cave itself became a kind of memory, not the brain's memory, but something the brain had made, something outside the skull that could endure beyond the individual life that created it. Then came clay tablets pressed with small wedge-shaped marks, then papyrus rolled and stored in cool rooms, then bound books, then photographs that could freeze the light falling on a face in a single moment that the brain itself would eventually soften and shift. Then digital archives, capable of holding more information than any single nervous system could contain across 1,000 lifetimes. Every one of these technologies is an acknowledgement. The brain's capacity is not unlimited. Encoding is imperfect. Storage is fragile. Retrieval changes what it touches. And so we have always offloaded outward, written things down not only because writing is useful, but because somewhere beneath articulation we understand that biological memory is not a permanent record. It is a living process. and living processes change. This is not a failure. It is one of the most distinctly human things we do. And now, at the outermost edges of what is currently understood, researchers are beginning to look at memory from the inside in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Specific neurons involved in forming particular memories have been identified in animal models. These cells appear to change at the moment an experience occurs, becoming part of the physical trace that experience leaves behind. In carefully controlled experiments, it has been possible to use light to activate these cells directly, reawakening something resembling the original experience in the animal that had it. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to suggest that the memory was there, encoded in the cells themselves, waiting in the tissue. What this means for human memory, for the treatment of trauma or depression, or the losses that come with disease, remains genuinely unknown. The distance between a mouse in a laboratory and a person lying quietly in the dark is vast, and that distance deserves honesty. But the questions being asked now are more precise than they have ever been. The mechanisms are slowly, carefully becoming visible. Somewhere in all of this, the whole long story drifts together. A man waking each morning into a permanent present. The structures that would have linked yesterday to today no longer available. Each new face a stranger. Each new room unfamiliar. And yet something of him still continuous, still kind, still curious. A woman asking about a car crash, changing a single word in her question, discovering that the changed word changed what people were certain they had seen. A researcher at a small desk testing himself on rows of meaningless syllables, charting forgetting, with the patience of someone who believes that anything, if observed carefully enough, will reveal its shape. A sleeping rat whose hippocampus replays the day's journey through a maze, the neurons firing in the same sequence they fired while the animal was moving, the brain threading experience into something more durable while the body rests. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from different angles, in different centuries, in different rooms. Memory is not storage. It is not a library or an archive or a recording, though we reach for those images because they give us somewhere to stand while we think. Memory is a process, continuous, reconstructive, shaped at every stage by attention and emotion and expectation and time. And you are not a person who has memories the way you have a coat or a key or a name written somewhere. You are, in some ongoing and genuinely important sense, made from memory. The self you carry through your days is not a fixed thing waiting to be accessed. It is rebuilt, moment by moment, from fragments and stories and interpretations that have themselves been rebuilt before. You remember something, and the remembering changes it slightly. The changed version is what you carry forward. The version you carry forward shapes what you notice next, and what you notice next becomes the new material from which the self is quietly assembled again. The wax tablet that could be smoothed and written over. The curve of forgetting that drops steeply and then levels. The childhood morning you can still almost feel the light of. The conversation that became, in memory, something slightly different from what it was. The face that is somehow still there even when the name is not. All of these are you, not the sum of them exactly, something more like the motion between them. Your body is resting. You can feel that, or perhaps you can barely feel anything, which is its own kind of rest. The weight of you settled into wherever you are, the breath moving without instruction, the room around you dark and very still. And while you rest, your brain is doing what it has done every night of your entire life, replaying the day in small and partial ways, moving fragile traces into more durable form, deciding, below any level of intention or awareness, what to keep close, and what to let recede into the background of everything you have ever been. Building the material of tomorrow's self from tonight's experience, including this quiet hour, including the soft and wandering attention of a mind already half given over to sleep. The cave painter's hand against the stone, the clay hardening in the air, the syllables on the paper, the neuron that changed when the memory first formed, the dreaming rat, the man in his permanent mourning. These drift now, gently, without needing to hold their shape or mean anything more than they already have. You do not need to remember any of this. It is enough that it passed through you. Rest well.